The First World War was a human tragedy on a global scale. It began in Europe, but countries from around the world were soon dragged into the fighting. The war lasted for 4 dark years, from 1914 to 1918, and a staggering 65 million men were mobilized to fight. Over 21 million people died, including 13 million civilians. The terrible impact of the war sparked revolutions, and it toppled once great empires, and changed the political map of Europe forever. The First World War was fought on such a massive scale that people called it the Great War, because never before had any war been fought in so many battlefields with such a vast array of powerful and destructive weapons and resulted in so many deaths. The reason why the war was so destructive was that it was the first major war between the newly industrialized nations of Europe. See, in the days before factories, trains, and steamships, wars often involved hundreds of men charging on battle on foot or on horseback and brandishing their swords. But this time, it was possible to transport millions of men quickly to the front and to arm with almost an endless supply of the latest mass-produced weapons and ammunition, such as machine guns, poison gas, and barbed wire, as well as planes, tanks, and submarines all came into use. Some for the first time, with a devastating effect. And the most powerful countries involved had empires with colonies, and influence in every corner of the globe. So although the war began in Europe, but it rapidly spread to the wider world, and soon men from colonies were drawn into the fray. And beyond Europe, fighting took place on land, also in Africa, Asia, and at sea, in the South Atlantic, and the Pacific. Altogether, 28 countries become involved in making it the first war to be called a world war. The war affected the lives of civilians more than any previous war, because for the first time, they were expected to help their country in the war effort. Workers had to step up agricultural and industrial production to keep their troops armed, clothed, and fed. All this meant that people far from the fighting became targets for enemy attack. Factories and supply routes were most at risk, but bombs fell on homes, schools, and places of worship too. This kind of unrestricted warfare is in which whole populations are involved. The effort is sometimes called total war. During the decades before 1914, Europe's most powerful nations split into 2 rival groups. The threat of war hung heavy in the air, while most governments hoped that the sheer size and strength of the 2 sides would prevent either from one attacking the other. But some began to fear that if Germany became stronger, it might just tip this precarious balance of power, then a major war would be inevitable. Until the late 19th century, Germany was made up of 39 small independent states. In the 1870s, Prussia was the most powerful of them, and led the German states in a successful invasion of northeast France, taking Alsace-Lorraine, and the Prussians convinced other German states to unite with them in creating a powerful new nation. Fearing retaliation from France, the Germans formed an alliance with Austria-Hungary. They promised each other military aid if Russia attacked either of them, or helped another country, such as France. In a war against them, in 1882, Italy joined to form a triple alliance known as the Central Powers. But secretly, the Italians also made a pact with the French to stay neutral if Germany invaded France. But the Germans wasted no time in building up their industries and expanding production of coal, iron, and steel in their new nation. They were so ambitious that by 1913 they had outstripped Britain as Europe's leading industrial power. The new ruler, Kaiser Wilhelm II, also had ambitions for, quote, a place in the sun to rival the empires of Britain and France. To do this, he expanded his army and ordered the construction of a new fleet of warships. By 1914, Germany had colonies in Africa, the Far East, and the Pacific, and the second largest fleet in the world after the British Royal Navy. And during the 1890s, France and Russia became more and more worried about Germany's growing power, especially as the Kaiser had given important positions in his government to military officials. In 1893, they formed an alliance against Germany and other Central Powers. The British, too, began to fear that German expansion would threaten their empire and navy. So in 1904, Britain and France signed the Entente Cordiale, meaning friendly understanding, offering mutual aid in case of war. 3 years later, Russia signed a similar agreement with Britain, the Triple Entente, as it's known. It wasn't yet a strict military alliance, but later they fought together as the Allied powers or the Allies. As the two power blocks squared up to each other, the atmosphere between them became more and more tense. Governments across Europe began modernizing their armed forces and making plans for what to do if war broke out. The rivalry was at its finest in the naval arms race that grew up between Germany and Britain. In 1906, the British launched a new type of warship named after its first kind, the HMS Dreadnought, powered by steam turbines and mounted with 10 big guns, each with a range of 6 miles or 10 kilometers. It was bigger, faster, and had more firepower than any other battleship ever. The Germans soon began to build a dreadnought-like style ships of their own. By 1914, Britain had 30 dreadnoughts, and Germany had built 20. War was looming on the horizon. On Sunday, June 28, 1914, disaster struck on the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo, which a 19-year-old student shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand in the heir to the Austrian throne. The assassination provided the spark that ignited the First World War. The Balkan states of southeastern Europe had a long history of wars and ethnic tension, during right back to time of the days of the Roman Empire. But during the 18th and 19th centuries, they had been fought over by two powerful empires, the Ottoman Turks and the Austro-Hungarians. Bosnia and Serbia had been ruled by the Turks until 1878, when Bosnia was handed over to Austria-Hungary, and Serbia was granted independence since then. Serbia had expanded its territory and was beginning to pose a threat to Austrian power in the region. Most Bosnians and Serbs were Slavic people. Many of them wanted to bring the end to Austro-Hungarian rule in Bosnia, so they could unite their two countries and form an independent Slavic nation. Passions ran high, and some revolutionaries were prepared to go extreme lengths to achieve this goal. When the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, announced an official visit to Sarajevo, a Serbian terrorist organization called the Black Hand decided it was time to strike. It recruited 3 Bosnian student activists armed with pistols, hand bombs, and cyanide capsules. Their mission was to assassinate the Archduke and then commit suicide so that the killing could not be linked to the Black Hand. The young Bosnians, Gorvil Princip, Nejo Korbujanovic, Prisco Grabez, were all dying slowly of tuberculosis. During their lives seemed small pace to pride for what they believed to be a just cause. When Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie arrived in Sarajevo, they were driven to a reception with the governor of Bosnia. The streets were lined with well-wishers cheering the Archduke as he waved from an open-top car. But hidden among the crowds were 3 assassins, 4 companies attended on murder as the motorcade passed. Nejo Korbujanovic, he hurled his bomb and it missed Franz Ferdinand's car, but it hit one behind and injuring his passengers and several onlookers. Chaos spread through the crowd as the Imperial Party sped for the safety of the city hall for now. The plot had failed. After the reception, the Archduke visited to those who injured in the earlier attack. His driver took a wrong turn and right past Gavril Princip, who had seized his chance, grabbing his pistol, and he fired at almost point blank, shooting Franz Ferdinand in the neck and Sophie in the abdomen. The driver raced back to the governor's residence, but the Archduke and his wife died before they could receive medical help. Princip and Korbujanovic both swallowed their cyanide, but the poison failed and they were arrested. Along with their accomplices under interrogation, they soon revealed that the Black Hand had orchestrated the assassination. The Austrians insisted that the Serbian government should take responsibility for the Black Hand's actions. They issued with a strict of demands when the Serbs failed to meet all these demands. Austria-Hungary, with German backing, declared war on Serbia on July 28th. Tensions between the European power had now came to a head. The die was cast. As the news of the assassination spread across Europe, few people could have imagined the impact it would have had. But when the Germans offered their unconditional support to Austria-Hungary, the complex web of European alliances came into play. What had started as a local crisis triggered a chain of events that sent Europe career headlong into a full-scale war. Within days of Austria's declaration of war on Serbia, Europe's military leaders put their war plans into action. On July 31st, the Russians announced that they were moving their army into position ready to help their Serbian allies against Austria-Hungary. If necessary, the Germans saw this an act of aggression. So on August 1st, they declared war on Russia. The French turned in and rallied their troops to support the Russians. This provoked the Germans to declare war on France on August 3rd. Germany was now at war with France to the west and Russia to the east. A war on 2 fronts would mean splitting the army into 2, weakening its effectiveness. But back in 1899, the military commander Alfred von Schlieffen had anticipated this problem and had prepared a plan. His theory was that Russian troops could take at least 6 weeks to get ready to cross the German frontier because their vast country had very poor rail network, and this would give the Germans plenty of time to defeat France on the western front before dealing with Russia on the eastern front. So on August 4th, 1914, the German army put the Schlieffen plan into action, and they marched into Belgium, heading for Paris by the shortest, flattest route. But the Germans did not expect Britain, the world's greatest sea power, to join a European land war, but by invading Belgium. They made a big mistake, okay? Belgium was a neutral country, and Britain had a long treaty to protect it. The German Chancellor considered the agreement a mere scrap of paper. But the British took it more seriously because Belgian ports provided a vital link between Britain and the rest of Europe. If the Germans captured them, it would severely harm British trade and security in the English Channel. 11 hours after the invasion, Britain declared war on Germany. Europe was up in arms, but many people still believed that diplomatic talks could defuse the situation. The British King, George V, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and Kaiser Wilhelm II were all grandsons of Queen Victoria. In early August, saw a flurry of telegrams sent from one cousin to another. They were convinced that their close relationship would make a war between their countries impossible. but it was too late to stop the military advance, and it had to be set in motion. As the fighting began, army commanders put into action war plans made years before, but neither the plans nor the men's training took into account the massive advances made in weapons technology. During the previous 2 decades, by the end of the first month's fighting, it was clear that the war was not going to according to plan. New weapons would mean a new kind of war. For the Schieffelin plan to work, the German Army Chief of Staff, Wilhelm von Moltke, needed his troops to push through Belgium and onto Paris as quickly as possible, but the Belgians put up an unexpectedly stubborn resistance from their forts around the city of Liege. They inflicted heavy losses on the Germans and slowed their progress, but eventually Moltke's troops smashed through the forts using their secret weapon, a massive siege cannon known as Big Bertha. After that, they swept through Belgium, terrorizing soldiers and the like. As the Germans advanced through Belgium, a British force of about 100,000 men landed in France and clashed with the Germans near the Belgian towns of Mons. At the same time, the French launched Plan 17, their strategy to take back Alsace-Lorraine, with a series of offensives along the Franco-German border that became known as the Battle of the Frontiers. At this stage, the pace of war was rapid and exhausting armies. Armies were constantly on the move across vast battlefields. It was the first time many of the soldiers had to face machine guns. Chaotic battles were fought under a hail of bullets. The Allies were outnumbered and outgunned at every turn. The French, fighting in red-blue uniforms, made easy targets, suffered huge casualties. Forced to retreat, they abandoned their Plan 17. Now, they were fighting to save Paris itself. To the east, Russian forces moved quicker than the Germans had expected. On August 4th, they invaded East Prussia, now it's northern Poland, where there was only a small German army. This forced Moltke to divert 100,000 troops away from France. On August 26, the Germans began their counterattack, driving the Russians into dense woodland near Tannenberg. There in just 4 days, Russia suffered one of the most crushing defeats of the war. With around 60,000 casualties, the Germans captured some 92,000 Russian soldiers and 500 guns. After further defeats at the Masurian Lakes, the Russian army retreated from East Prussia for good. Despite the Russian desertion, the German head came with 25 miles or 40 kilometers of Paris. The French government fled along with million partisans, leaving the rest to prepare for a siege. On September 3rd, the French commander-in-chief of the Allied troops, Joseph Joffre, ordered his men to take up a defensive position along the River Marne. 3 days later, the Battle of the Marne began, strengthened by extra British troops and French reinforcements. Transported from Paris in a fleet of taxis, the Allies now had advantage. The exhausted German opponents had marched more than 150 miles or 240 kilometers, and they were running out of supplies. By September 9th, the battle had turned against them, and they began to retreat. The Schieffelin plan had failed, and Paris was saved. So that was the war to end all wars. This is only chapter 1. I will put this in chapters because I don't want to make it longer and people will be bored out. So yeah, I have nothing really else to say here, so I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care.